we see a clear trend that the closer you follow the MIND diet, the less likely you are to leave good years on the table, the less likely you are to die prematurely, and the more likely you are to have a longer health span.
Hi, I'm Ginger Hultin, your host of the Good Clean Nutrition podcast. I'm an integrative registered dietitian nutritionist, and today I'm really excited to be talking about the MIND diet with my friend and colleague, Maggie Moon. Maggie Moon is a highly acclaimed nutritionist specializing in brain health. She is a Columbia University educated, culinary school trained, accredited registered dietitian with clinical training from New York Presbyterian Hospital, of Columbia and Cornell universities. She's a best-selling author, educator, and science communications professional. Before we begin, I'm excited to share a very wonderful review from the show. This person said, "I love the range of topics this podcast offers. It's great that the host and guests dive not only into best practices for optimal health, but also acknowledge the barriers, socioeconomic, genetic, environmental, that people may face in attaining what society tends to view as optimal health too. It's rare to find balance on social media or in podcasts, ! So I love hearing from you, and it's actually really easy for you to leave a rating. Wherever you happen to be listening on your podcast, you can go to the review section and just drop a quick star rating. If you feel like taking it one small step further, I'd love to hear your actual feedback. You can drop me a quick review. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I want to do all things MIND diet specifics, frequently asked questions, myths, how it works, why it's important, all of that. So can you define the MIND diet and talk about that acronym?
So first off, MIND it's about the brain, but it's actually an acronym in itself. So MIND. The M alone stands for Mediterranean Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. So there's an acronym within it, DASH. Mediterranean DASH, that's the M. Intervention for neurodegenerative delay. So Mediterranean DASH intervention for neurodegenerative delay.
Mediterranean, we know, is often used for cardiovascular disease, and the DASH diet, dietary approaches to stop hypertension, is like unprocessed diet, high in potassium, low sodium, like really used for blood pressure control.
That's exactly right. The Mediterranean, of course, is based on more of the cultural foodways in the Mediterranean, but DASH is really a U.S. specific therapeutic diet to lower blood pressure specifically. And both have shown great results in the heart health space for different reasons. And that's really why the researchers behind the MIND diet from Rush University combined these two diets and then took a look at the other foods and nutrients that were showing a lot of promise in the brain health space to adapt these two diets together and then optimize it for brain health.
I know the diet's a bit complex because we're talking about Mediterranean diet and DASH, and then on top of it, what makes it good for the brain. So walk me through the different components here.
So there are 15 food groups. There's 10 to really encourage, and then there's 5 to avoid or limit. Not eliminate, but limit. So it's all about balance. You can still have some of those foods. Let me go through the basics. So vegetables every single day, leafy green vegetables in particular, at least 6 times a week. Then you've got whole grains 3 times a day. You've got nuts 5 times a week. So weekday snack. You've got beans 4 times a week, berries twice a week. But no specific fruit recommendation, but berries, because they're so high in polyphenols, twice a week.
And just for reference, polyphenols are a word for antioxidants generally.
Yes. So lean poultry at least twice a week. Fish once a week at least. More is better for heart health. Olive oil as your main dietary fat. And then a glass of wine, 5 ounces, no more nor less, once a day. I will say that everything that I just said, with the exception of wine, is sort of a minimum. So you can go crazy with your leafy green vegetables. You can go crazy with other vegetables, have as many whole grains as you want, So I think wine is the only one where it's really specific, where you want to hit that sweet spot anymore and you're actually increasing your risk. So those are the foods that we really want to encourage on the plate. And I know it sounds like a lot when I just kind of rattle them off, but you can actually combine them all into a big grains and greens bowl and really knock out perhaps all 10 in one meal. So functionally, when you're putting this into practice for your life, it can be quite simple to achieve. the 5 types of foods that we want to limit, not have as much of: butter, whole fat cheese, fried fast food, red meat, and pastries. Now, the thing is, these 5 groups were really designed to reduce the impact of saturated fat on the brain. They also happen to reduce added sugars, which we know are pro-inflammatory. So butter is less than a tablespoon a day. I think that's pretty easy to do. Whole fat cheese, less than once a week. So maybe once every couple weeks. Fried fast food, less than once a week. So again, just once every couple weeks if you enjoy it. Red meat, less than 4 times a week. So that's up to 3 times a week. That's still, substantial. I don't eat red meat 3 times a week, but if you want it, you still can. Pastries and sweets, less than 5 times a week. So there's still room for pastries and sweets 4 times a week. Now, the more you can reduce these, the better. So it's not like we're asking you to get up to that limit, but just so that people know that there's a lot of room for balance. And I think that makes it really appealing that you don't have to be perfect in what you're eating and doing all the time. And you can still really benefit by really leaning into the brain healthy foods and hopefully taking over some of that brain space and the plate space with those foods to crowd out some of the less healthy options.
As soon as you started saying what to avoid, saturated fat and sugar, fried foods, that reminds me of the Western diet or standard American diet. What does that do to the brain?
Well, first of all, the space in research for nutrition and brain health is relatively young. And a lot of our nutrition research isn't designed to study brain health appropriately. So that's really changed in the last 10 years or so. So it's exciting how much we have learned. But the reason I mention that is that if you take a look at some of the nutrition research that's out there and you try to reverse engineer it for brain health, you're going to come up with some mixed results potentially. And the fact is, when a study does a good job of controlling for the type of fat being used, as well as the baseline dietary fat intake, we see consistently that diets that are higher in saturated fat are worse for brain health and raise the risk of dementia and cognitive decline. And so saturated fat's very closely linked to negative cholesterol levels, higher levels of cholesterol that could be damaging to the brain. And one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease is related to the cholesterol transport system. And so we think there's a link there. We also have seen an association between saturated fat and dysfunction at the blood-brain barrier. And we want that gatekeeper to be robust and doing its job of letting in the good stuff and keeping out the bad stuff. What I really appreciated about the Mind Diet pattern was that it was not super specific to a culture. I really liked that it was really just food groups. I think olive oil is the example of a food within the Mind Diet that is specific to a cultural foodway, but predominantly it's broad enough that it can be adapted to different heritage diets. What I have personally in my own practice developed over the last several years is more of a focus of heritage diets and optimal brain health. And I think what has really fired me up in the last couple years specifically is that there have been research studies that have created research-based mind diets for non-Western cultures and still shown benefits for brain health. So that's so exciting. Something that I knew to be true in my heart is now being shown in the research. And that just gives me so much wind in my sails to talk about it even more and to expose people to the research findings so that they can then understand how to apply the Mind Diet to their cultural diet.
You wrote a book a few years ago called The Mind Diet, a scientific approach to enhancing brain function and helping prevent Alzheimer's and dementia. And importantly, you're publishing an update later this year in December 2024. And I know that's been a lot of work for you because the research has grown hugely.
When the first book was in development, there were the 2 key studies out of Rush University that had been published in October 2015, and my book was out in the fall of 2016. And since then, over 150 papers have discussed the Mind Diet. About 60% of that research is in the cognitive space, but also it's now expanded to related outcomes around cardiovascular disease, around diabetes, and topics like that.
And in your book or in the research, how much are you weaving in sleep, exercise, other things that affect healthy brains as we age?
I'm really glad you mentioned those because they all have a big impact. And whenever I talk about brain health and nutrition, I make sure to talk about the fact that a healthy diet is fundamental to brain health. It's a cornerstone of brain health, but it is part of an ecosystem of your lifestyle that can really support brain health. And so it's important, but it is just one piece of it. And so sleep, managing stress, being social, moving regularly, all of these things are so important. So I do touch on that in the book. I have in there some lifestyle guidelines that are backed up by large authoritative bodies like the Global Council for Brain Health. Of course, it is all about the food. So primarily, I'd say 80 to 90% of it is an update to the nutrition research as well as how to apply it. I created all new recipes, some with more of a global flair. So I think that's exciting.
Orgain offers a wide variety of great tasting, diabetes-friendly nutrition products featuring impressive nutrition profiles with 0 to minimal added sugar. Right now, my favorite is Orgain's 20 grams of protein plant-based chocolate shake. It tastes great, there's no added sugar, and it's convenient to grab on the go. Check it out for yourself at Orgain.com. And as people get older, why does a mind diet and brain health in general matter so much from a structural perspective?
The population is aging, and in the United States, the population is actually aging at a greater pace than the rest of the world. I think it's 1 in 6 people will be over 60 by 2030. It is one of the largest demographic shifts of our lifetime. The reason that's important is because aging is the number one factor in cognitive decline. That's why something like the Mind Diet or other diets that are good for brain health, moving well for your brain, other lifestyle factors, all of these things are so essential. And it's never too soon, never too late, but there is a critical time period that we need to be paying attention to these things.
Can you talk more about that? I'd love to hear about what is the right time period, Maggie?
30s, 40s, and 50s are really the pivotal time to make these lifestyle changes to protect the brain. By the time we see cognitive impairment, cognitive decline in our later years, it's probably been decades between the time that we were exposed to behaviors that were either brain supportive or not so great for our brain health. So we see higher rates of cognitive decline starting around age 65. It's not a magic switch. It doesn't happen at 65 or 60. So take that 2 decades back and you're in your 40s. And so that's a super critical time. Also for women, premenopause, perimenopause, and menopause, there's a lot that's going on hormonally that's going to be more challenging for women. You know, we talk about brain fog or menopause brain that happens in midlife. This is another reason why we need to be so vigilant about our brain health in midlife.
It's interesting because I feel like so many people in their 30s and 40s, you're working, you're super busy, you have kids, you're maybe taking care of your parents. I don't know if it's on everyone's radar, but perhaps people are looking ahead and seeing cognitive decline in their parents or grandparents. Is that how you find people come into it, or are people more aware?
When I hear from people who are already in their older adulthood, of course, they might be feeling effects for themselves. But honestly, a lot of people I hear from are caregivers or maybe one of their parents or just someone they know has been affected. There's a newer term that we've been using for the last under 5 years or so called subjective cognitive decline. And the latest stats are 1 in 10 adults in America over the age of 45 have experienced subjective cognitive decline. It is self-reported, and it's when you've noticed challenges with your memory in the past year. So it's been bothersome enough for a long enough time that you've noticed it. And maybe it affects some of your daily living. Maybe you need help with some activities of daily living like finances or food prep or housekeeping.
Yeah, that's really significant. There is some emerging research on using diet and lifestyle to reverse cognitive aging. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So cognitive aging is considered part of biological aging as opposed to chronological aging. So I think that's important to just lay the groundwork. We are all familiar with chronological aging. That's the time since our birth certificate date. That's the date on our driver's license. But biological aging, and as part of that, cognitive aging, is really about functional aging. How well are we performing physically, mentally, cognitively? And what the research has found is that overall, the MIND diet as a pattern can help slow down cognitive aging and make your brain younger. And so various specific foods, whether it's blueberries or strawberries or walnuts, there has been research showing that people who eat more of these foods might be younger cognitively by a year, 2 years, 3 years, right around that time frame. But altogether, the initial MIND diet research showed that following the whole of the guideline, the whole of the dietary pattern, can help slow down brain aging by up to 7.5 years. And if you add lifestyle factors on top of that, sleeping well and managing stress and staying connected to friends and family and being involved in the community, it could be even more. It's going to compound. So my mother, she's 82 this year, and I, just for fun, had her telomeres tested, and she is biologically 64.
No way.
And
that's amazing.
It's amazing. And it's not an exact science, but generally she eats well. She's the one that started me eating well, of course, because she raised me. She gardens every day. She stays in touch with her friends and does all the things that we would really love for more people to be doing.
Can you define telomeres and talk about how you do that testing? Because I totally want to do it.
It's sort of like how a pedometer may not tell you the exact number of steps you're taking, but over time, you'll see that you are taking more steps one day than another. So it's not so much the exact number that matters. It's more about the trend. And so telomeres, it's good to get them tested if you're interested in it over like time. So maybe a 3-month period or a 6-month period or something like that, just to see the direction. Now, telomeres are the protective end caps of our DNA. So they're like the ends of shoelaces that keep the shoelace from unraveling. They're non-coding. So it means that as the telomeres deteriorate over time naturally, which they do, it's not going to affect how your cells are functioning because it's non-coding DNA. It's protective. And we have seen that moderate length telomeres, not too long, not too short, is what we're really aiming for. We don't want our cells to live forever. That can lead to some negative consequences, but we also don't want early cell death and dysfunction. So keeping them right in that sweet spot is helpful. And I know I mentioned this already, but it's an early science. So it's really directional. I wouldn't say, hey, this is your exact telomere age and this is exactly what you want. It's more like, am I going in the right direction?
That's really cool. And can you just like get that test?
There are more and more of these third-party labs that will do the test for you. The one I chose for my parents is associated with researchers that I've been following from Columbia University who are quite involved and have been the leaders in biological aging. And so that's why I chose this specific lab. But there are several labs out there, and they range in price from maybe like under $100 to a few $100s.
Maybe if you are participating with those companies, like some of them are also including that in their research, hopefully.
You can always opt in for that, and you can also opt out of that. So you do have control over your own privacy and your own data. And if you are doing research into telomere companies and labs, I would make sure that that's the condition. So if you don't want to contribute to the overall data set, which is typically anonymized, it's not linked to you personally, but everyone has their own opinions and their feelings on that. So just make sure that you have the option to keep your data private if you want to.
I want to hear more about different aspects of research if you're able to dive into it. I know, again, this is a huge area of passion for you, and you've been reading all of the 150 studies for your new book. But what about premature death and like leaving any good years left on the table? How does a MIND diet overlap with that?
Yeah. So overall, I mentioned that most of the research is in cognitive health. After that, there's something like 20 plus different topics that have been studied. And from there, premature death is one of the areas that there actually is a bit more research. It's observational, but we see a clear trend that the closer you follow the MIND diet, the less likely you are to leave good years on the table, the less likely you are to die prematurely, and the more likely you are to have a longer health span. That's also linked to Some of the other areas that are a little more substantive in terms of how much research there is around cardiovascular, cardiometabolic health, as well as healthy aging. And those things are all related. And that's where the bulk of the good science is right now.
We're so lucky to have access to that and have the well-designed studies like you're mentioning. You also said something that's so important is there's this big shift right now to talking about health span rather than lifespan.
Health span is living life in good health. And it's how many years of good health can you have? There's potential for us to all have all of our years in good health. But unfortunately, many of us live many, many years later in life, towards the ends of our lives, in poor health. And that really impacts quality of life, our ability to live independently. I don't think that's what we would wish for ourselves or anyone that we care about.
What about mental health like anxiety and depression? Is there an overlap with the Mind Diet and mental health in general?
There is absolutely an overlap. And so many of the brain supportive foods and nutrients from the Mind Diet are also going to support the brain processes that support better mental health. And anxiety, stress, and depression are the top leading causes of disability and mental health concern. And so the fact that there is some overlap there is really encouraging. This is another space that I'm very interested in, and it's another space that's also grown a lot. I gave a talk 2019 or 2020 about nutrition for mental health, and then I updated the talk just last summer. And I was really impressed about how the research had ballooned in this area. We still need more. It's still a young field, but there's so much more interest in this space. And over again, we see that reducing pro-inflammatory sugars and saturated fat is going to be better for mental health. We see that high polyphenol intake and a prudent diet is really going to support better mental health. Researchers in the space are often cautious, and they talk about the bidirectional nature of this. So we don't know how much mental health concerns are creating a environment where we're eating poorly. And we don't know how much eating poorly is creating an environment for poor mental health. So they can be related. And also going back to cognitive health, we know that often declining cognition and also diagnosis of maybe dementia or even mild cognitive impairment can create a situation where you have obviously anxiety, stress, and even depression. So there is that association as well.
Yeah, that gets really confusing really fast. I wrote an article a couple of years ago about mood and anxiety, depression, and food. And it was exactly what you're saying. It's like, okay, if you eat more poorly, does it worsen anxiety, depression? Or there's a lot of research that shows people with anxiety, depression are often eating more poorly. So it's like the chicken or the egg kind of situation.
And that is confusing. I always want to find a clear, simple answer for people. But right now, I think we just have to understand that we don't have all the answers. But in the meantime, everything we're recommending, we know is going to be good for so many other things. And so there's really no harm and a lot of upside to putting these things into practice. So whether or not we have the answer, there are so many reasons to eat better.
Right, because we have a lot of evidence that it does work. And then you also mentioned something interesting, which is the Mind Diet can help, would you say reduce inflammation or control inflammation? How do you see the connection there?
I think both. Obviously, some of the nutrients that are inherent, higher omegas, higher antioxidants, and polyphenols will obviously help reduce and manage any oxidative stress that can lead to inflammation. There's also some data around specific components, downregulating genes that are often leading to inflammation. So there's both the reactive, so once there is inflammation, kind of soothing it, but there's also the preemptive, which is just to cut off at the pass processes that are going to lead to those negative impacts.
I've done a lot of work in the anti-inflammatory space, and I just see so many parallels between anti-inflammatory approaches to diet and the Mind Diet. Like, it seems really similar.
An overall anti-inflammatory approach is right in line with how you can support brain health. And it's one of the overall approaches and concepts that have been studied to support brain health.
You're so familiar with the research. Where do you want to see more? What would you project as next in this space?
in the last few years, there has been this idea of cognitive resilience and cognitive reserve. So these two concepts are related. And this is about, despite what the world throws at you, despite maybe signs of dementia and cognitive decline physiologically in the brain, so plaques and tangles, can you find an alternate route towards cognitive function? Can you find a different pathway in the brain to remember a name or a number or to understand how a zipper works? All these things are cognitive functions. And so this idea behind resilience and reserve is so interesting to me. For example, seafood is a great one. We know that people who eat more fish have better cognitive performance. But we know from their brains that they have more mercury, which is a known neurotoxin. So how does that work out? It's a balance, and it shows you that the benefit outweighs any risk. And so despite that physical sign of mercury in the brain, you're still functioning better cognitively. This is an area that we need more research in to think about and validate how diet and lifestyle can really help us no matter what happens, no matter what we're dealing with in terms of stress or signs of dementia. The other area from a sociological perspective that I would love to see more of is more research in more diverse communities and more diverse foodways. I was at a gathering yesterday and people were asking me what I did. And I made sure to emphasize that it's not a specific prescription. These are guidelines. So you apply to your own individual preferences and foodways. And I just saw the light come on and they really just resonated with that. And they said, of course, then it's not a fad. It's not something that you're doing that's outside your normal life. It's part of your lifestyle. You're able to incorporate it into your own traditions. There's no other way that we're going to be effective in this other than by respecting people's individuality and where they come from and the foods and the ways that they eat that are important to them.
Yeah, personalized nutrition. It really is a path forward. And I'm glad that you highlighted that the MIND diet is not like something you do for 2 weeks or something that's going to have you losing weight quickly, or, it's not this thing that you do to fix something. It's like a long-term overall approach to your health. And we're looking like decades down the road and how we improve brain health, cardiovascular health, lower inflammation, probably other systems too, I imagine.
My perspective has always been from that public health perspective and how do we improve society as a whole. But with my public health brain, I want to avoid this tidal wave of dementia in the next 10 to 20 years. And even though some of the benefits are years down the road, eating this way is going to make you feel good today. And it's going to make you feel good tomorrow. And so there are also these immediate benefits that people will notice when they shift to higher nutrient density foods.
It's important to see positive changes right away because that's what's motivating to keep going. So let's say you will lower your inflammation right now. You probably will feel better. Or I could see some ties to maybe the gut microbiome with all the high fiber foods. Maybe that helps you feel better. Or, you have better blood flow and heart health. All those things could make you feel better immediately. And like you said, be cognitively sharper to perform. People can feel that when they change their diets.
100%. They definitely will.
So if you want to start with a couple things today, there's the 15 foods that are good and the 5 to avoid. If you're telling me sitting in front of you, all right, Ginger, this is what you need to do. Where do you start today?
Snacks are a really great place to start because then you're not disrupting a major meal time and pattern, but it's just low-hanging fruit for behavior change. So swap your snack, make it nuts 5 times a week during the work week. Put that in your bag or your desk. I also think that because leafy greens are such an amazing component of the MIND diet, I would look for ways to add that as a first step. I love baby salad greens. They're mild. They're delicious. There's a lot of variety there. And I add them to everything. I add them if I'm making a piece of toast with an egg on it, I'll put a big handful of leafy greens underneath my egg. If I have takeout, then I'll add some leafy greens underneath the takeout before I rewarm it back up the next day. Everything I do, I'll just add a handful of leafy greens. Smoothies, soups, snacks. That's one specific food that we could all stand to eat more of.
I'm super inspired, and thanks for all your concrete takeaways and just bringing the Mind Diet to life for us. And I'm looking forward to the next episode where we'll continue our conversation exploring Mind Diet specifics. We're going to talk through key nutrients for brain function, what foods to eat, as well as a few to avoid, and how to incorporate the Mind Diet in various ways in your life. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Our show is sponsored by Orgain and produced in collaboration with Large Media. That's LARJ Media. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Good Clean Nutrition Podcast. To stay up to date on the latest podcast episodes, be sure to follow. If you like this podcast, I'd love for you to let me know. You can rate and review this show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or you can give us a thumbs up on YouTube if you're watching right now. I'm Ginger Hultin. You can find me online at gingerhultin.com. Thanks so much for listening.